Can you imagine getting a new client on your caseload who is two, has had a severe traumatic accident? It is your first year as a speech language pathologist, and your supervisor does not help and support you. That is just one story that Lynn Dudek, my colleague and friend, shared today on the Autism Outreach podcast. Welcome to the show. We are talking today all about mentorship and supervision. We are talking about the nitty gritty of what makes a wonderful supervision experience and what makes a horrible or not great supervision experience. Lynn talks all about some of the regulations we have for supervision for speech therapists, and we touch on it for a little bit for BCBAs as well. That clinical fellowship year, your first year into the field as a speech language pathologist, is so important and really sets a tone for your start in the profession. We're going to break it down for you today on the Autism Outreach podcast. Remember, if you like this episode or if there are other topics that you want to hear about, like this show over on Apple Podcasts and leave a review. I always love hearing from you. Let's get into our conversation today.
You're listening to Autism Outreach Podcast, a podcast full of ready-to-use strategies to help those with autism strengthen their communication skills. Here's your host, Rose Griffin of ABA Speech, a speech therapist and board-certified behavior analyst who shares tips you can use in your next therapy session.
Thanks so much for coming back onto the show. We have a great episode today with Lynn Dudek, who is a former guest and now my friend, and co-presenter. So welcome to the Autism Outreach Podcast. I'm thrilled that you're here. We're going to be talking about a really important topic today. We're going to be talking about mentorship. And I love this idea. I think maybe it was something you had suggested. And I was like, oh, wow, we haven't talked about that yet on the podcast. And Lynn, we're up to almost episode 200, which I can't even believe it.
That's so exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you. So Lynn came onto the show, episode 109. We will link that into the show notes. And we talked about probably one of our favorite topics, which we've presented on in the past, and hopefully have some more presentations coming down the pipeline, all about collaboration, specifically SLP BCBA collaboration, because I'll tell you what, there's a lot of work to be done in that area as we each make a funny face. But today we're going to be talking about mentorship. So when you had entered the field, as you became a speech therapist first, right?
Correct.
And then a BCBA?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
I knew that.
Next month is 32 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yep.
Applause. She has done this. I'm now at 20 plus. So let me think.
Yay.
I got out of graduate school in 2003. So I guess it's 20 years. Yeah. But it feels like 20 years. I'm not going to lie. It feels like 20 years.
Especially these last few.
Yes, exactly.
Have been really rough.
Yes, absolutely. When you entered the field as a speech therapist, and we're going to talk about what a clinical fellowship year is and things like that, but did you have any type of mentor when you entered the field, or, your first year? What did that look like for you?
So I had what started out as the worst experience and then the best experience. I started out job close to my hometown in southwestern Ohio, and was hired for my clinical fellowship specifically to fulfill a couple new contracts that this company had taken on. And I got the job in March. I started in June, and my first day of work, they said, "Oh, we decided to not take those contracts. So you're going to be in our outpatient clinic." Okay. So I started, and basically the person who was designated as my CF supervisor was the only other speech pathologist in the company. She had never had a clinical fellow, and all of the cases that she was not interested in came to me. So my very first case was a 2.5-year-old who had been playing outside and drowned upside down in a 5-gallon bucket.
Oh.
And this little one when medics got there was gone.
Yeah.
They brought them back, and this child neurologically was devastated. I had no idea where to start at
Mhm.
all. And so I did what any good new clinician would, and I went to my supervisor, and the response was, then I guess you better figure it out.
Ooh, stop.
And no,
Stop it. Let
hand to
me ask you,
God.
hold on. Let me ask you, what were the contracts going to be? Were the contracts going to be in a school
Yes.
or okay, I wanted to okay,
Yep.
so you were thinking pediatric, but it was going to be school based.
It was going to be school based. And I was only going to be there for a short time because I was getting married and moving out of town. But this was going to be a great experience.
Yeah.
And this is well before the days of Google and websites and all of that great
Yes.
resources that we have now. So I went home and I cried
Yeah.
and then decided I better figure out what to do with this kiddo. And you know what? I figured it out on my own. And all of the kids that were handed off to me were kids who had incredible medical complexities and very high needs. And so it was baptism by fire. And I had to figure it out because literally my supervisor was no help. And several months in to my CF, then I resigned because moved up here to Columbus and I got a new job at a new private practice and had a variety of contracts I was covering, everything from adults to in-home to schools to you name it. I was covering it. And my CF supervisor for the remainder of my CF was the most fantastic, supportive, checking, whenever you have a clinical fellow, ASHA says you have to check in this often, and the state of Ohio says you have to check in this often. Nope. Anytime she would just send me a message, give me a call. Hey, how you doing? She'd drop into a contract.
Hmm.
How you doing? What do you need? She was always available to me. And it was that cumulative experience that made me say, okay, it's at some point in my career, I'm gonna be a supervisor.
Mhm.
And now I know very clearly what not to do and very clearly what to do.
Wow, that is
Yeah,
really something. That is so the person that was your initial supervisor, was she wasn't the owner of the company, was she
she was not.
she was another SLP and she was the only
Yep.
other SLP
She was the only other
there.
SLP. Yep.
Okay. Wow. That is so hard. I talk about that a lot where now it's almost like we're inundated with information and we have to
Right.
be analytical, which I know you
Mm-hmm.
are. That's why we're friends, and decide what you're going to take from this and take from that. And even though that thing might not be 100% evidence based, there might be one little thing you might take that sounds okay,
Right.
or is what you were already doing anyway. But back in the day, I joke, I did not have a that horrible of an experience, but I did have a supervisor who just was no help. And so I say, I was just saying this last week when I presented for a group out of California, and I said, I had to really dig into the research. And when I
Yep.
say research, Asha used to send us journals like
Yes.
printed. Remember those?
Yes.
I liked
Oh,
that actually.
yes. Had boxes and boxes and boxes
Yes.
of them.
It was a nice resource because there were no podcasts. And if it wasn't covered at your state level conference, and if you even had the funds to go to that, you just were not
Yes.
going to get the information. There was no speechpathology.com. There was no ABA speech connection. They're just
Nothing.
very, very limited. And you tried to really, I know that it seemed like a lot of regional get togethers for people because people really were meeting in person when we
Yep.
started in the field to really have that mentorship and support. So to not have that, oh, but what is amazing that you had that one that you were like, this is bad. We don't want to
Mm-hmm.
ever be this person. And then this
Exactly.
is good. And that's so nice that you had that experience though, because I think some people will probably fall on the continuum of just what you shared, right? So
Right.
you're like,
Exactly. They have their
yeah,
horror story, and
yeah,
then they get to the point in their career when, okay, they've got enough experience and now it's time to be a mentor, to be a supervisor. And because they've had such a poor experience, they turn that down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really rough
Yes.
because our pre-service grad students and then our new graduate CFs need that support, and they need that support from knowledgeable, confident supervisors so that they can become knowledgeable, confident clinicians and eventually supervisors. And I think that's what our charge is, that
Yeah.
we have to know what we're doing so that the people coming behind us know what they're doing.
Absolutely. And I think that there is an ASHA requirement for supervision that people need to take, which is a great idea from ASHA. And in the field of speech pathology, we have something called a clinical fellowship year, your CFY year. That is a jargon type. I've been talking about jargon a lot on social media, but that if you're listening and you're a BCBA or a parent, it's your first year as a speech language pathologist, and you are paid like your average salary or what your starting salary would be, but you do have this mentor, this supervisor, and that is not something I don't think that takes place in applied behavior analysis. Although
Correct.
I was listening to a podcast, and I think it's Dr. Marianne Jane Weiss. I have not had her on the podcast, but she was talking about would be a great idea. that would be a great idea. That it is really somebody, there is rules about the minimum amount of times that your supervisor has to see you, what has to be in person, or I think it can happen over teletherapy as well.
Right.
And you get feedback, and then you end up checking these forms and doing a checklist and sending it to ASHA or your supervisee, I believe. I haven't done it in a while, but it is a really nice system so that you have something, because you could get hired in at a great company as a new BCBA and have all this support, or you could get hired in somewhere that's focused more on the financial side of things, is not maybe a mom and pop place, and not get any support, and then get
Right.
students maybe like you say, or maybe students who are engaging in self-injurious behavior, and that's not really in your competence or your wheelhouse. And we know as BCBAs, that's unethical to take
Exactly.
that client, but not everybody running an ABA clinic is a BCBA. I don't think so. I know
Correct.
people get into these. And now with a lot of BCBAs, we've been talking about a little bit more on the podcast, being employees of a public school district, which on one hand is great, but on the other hand, it can be tricky too with our ethics, because I feel like the ethical guidelines were not made for public school BCBA work, right?
I
It's
think you're
just,
right about that.
yeah.
I think there's a lot of gray area, and then these poor clinicians are stuck in the middle of what a district is expecting of them and what our ethical code is saying you must or mustn't do.
Yeah. There's a lot of ethics. I teach the ethics class here at Kent State, and
I love that.
there's always a lot of discussion on some of these things. But I think
Right.
that school-based issue, yeah, it's going to come in a lot. So speaking of the CFY year in supervision, I guess I'm wondering, have you been a CFY supervisor, and what was that process like
So
for you?
many times. I'm in upper double digits
Oh, that's
now.
cool.
And I love it. I love having new grads. I think that we're in a pattern right now where companies who employ speech pathologists don't want to bring on clinical fellows because of
Mm,
if you do it correctly, you're investing a great deal of time
yeah.
in that new clinician. Uh, we love to have clinical fellows in our company. We bring them in. There are, we've got a very specific planned out experience for their clinical fellowship to make sure that they meet all of the ASHA requirements and that they meet all of the licensure requirements for the state of Ohio. And a lot of it overlaps, but there are some differences. But we want that clinical fellow to have a great experience. The other part of that is whether it's me or one of my other speech pathologists, I want them to have a phenomenal experience as a supervisor. And so
Mhm.
we focus a great deal on the supervisor experience as well, in terms of self-assessments and knowing what your supervisory style is. Those
Mhm.
things are very important, and things that, they weren't covered when I was in grad school.
Mm-mm. Not at all. Not
No.
not one bit. Have you ever taken, this is as an aside, but I'm in these business masterminds, with having an
Mhm.
online business, something in people talk about a lot is like a personality test. It's called an
Yes.
Enneagram or something like
Yep.
that. And so what happens is you take this assessment. It's free, I believe, and a lot of people either know about it or you completely don't. But I think it lends itself to this. I want to think about how to tie that in. I feel like we're coming up with a new CEU training that's for the membership next year about
Right.
supervision. This could be really good. But
I
I
think
like
this would be really good.
Yes, I do too. You take like the personality test because I think that's how you are a supervisor, how you accept feedback. And so, anyway, this personality test gives you a number, and that number is associated with I'm a 2, which is like an
I
empath.
forget
And
what I am.
see, we'll have to do it again, part
Yep.
of the CEO. But it's kind of neat because I was at a conference last week here in Cleveland called the CEX conference, which is this big business conference. And I met a guy, we had the same speech coach, and he's a 1. And he was like, that's very like type A, very perfectionist. And I was like, oh, I'm a 2. And he knew exactly what that meant. But I think it lends itself to how are we as supervisors? How are we as supervisees as far as accepting feedback? And I would imagine some of those things are discussed. And you're right that those things were never discussed. Never ever.
I learned more about leadership and supervisory styles and leadership styles when I got my MBA. That was an entire class
right.
and project. We did all the, as a matter of fact, we were grouped into cohorts based on, we had to do several personality assessments before our first class. And opposites were purposefully grouped up. And it was a great experience because you had to learn to work with and collaborate with people who thought very differently than you did.
Yeah. Which simulates real life, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It does. But there's a new article out through ASHA by, I think the last name is Abel. I've been talking about it, and it just talks about when we have disagreements. And kind of the point of the article is that we're always it's framed around IEP meetings and IEP teams, but I feel like there's always going to be some level of disagreement in our jobs, it's like learning how to deal with that and being okay with that, which I think sometimes is hard for people because I know that I don't like to get in disagreements.
Right.
It's mentally taxing, I guess, to get into those things. Like you said that you were so upset with your supervisor when it wasn't probably what you had envisioned. It wasn't the support, because we always want to do a good job in the work that we do, but especially your first year, you're scared, you're nervous. At least that's how I felt. And you want to do a good job, and you want to be with somebody who's going to be supportive, which actually goes with my next question of which we kind of talked over a little bit, but what qualities do you think make for a bad supervision experience? And then what qualities make for a good supervision experience?
So that's such an important question. And it's one of the questions whenever I'm interviewing someone, I always ask them, what do you expect in a supervisor? Because I want to make sure that we can meet their expectations, but it's all the things that we would want in our supervision. So we want someone who is a good communicator. You want someone who is invested in building relationships, someone who knows how to set professional goals. Because, we're mentoring these new grads, and they may not know what they don't know. So we have to help them along and help them set some professional goals. We want someone who's really good at assessing performance. There's nothing worse than, you have that monthly meeting with your supervisor and they haven't seen you perform your clinical duties. They haven't read enough of your evaluations. So how are they going to appropriately assess your performance? We want somebody who is good at providing feedback, and being good at providing feedback doesn't always mean that you just tell them, oh, you're great. You're doing great. We know as BCBAs, your feedback has to be specific. You have to be talking about observable behaviors. And so I really like, whenever I do any supervision, any observation, I use a standard format where I do the highlights. Like, these were the things that just knocked my socks off during your session. And I start with those. Hey, here are the highlights of the sessions. You were so organized. You immediately went to pairing. You were so keyed in on what this kiddo needed. Great job. And then I go to the coaching aspect. So the things that maybe I want the clinician to consider, or maybe the things that have a little bit of room for improvement.
Mm-hmm.
And then I do the overall evaluation of the session. So kind of a summary, a wrap up. And I write that out and I hand that to that clinician before that session is over, so that they can read it, because my follow-up question is, what do you think went really well in the session?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think maybe were some areas to focus on, work on a little bit? And how do you think it went overall? And if we have two completely different ideas about that session, then we need to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
Did I miss something? Did they miss something? I don't know. But we have to be able to talk about it. So I have to give good feedback.
Yeah, I
And
love
then,
that. I love that. And I think it's like when we learn about behavioral skills training as BCBAs, which I've done as
yes,
CEU in the connection about, we have that four-pronged approach. But the last part is feedback, which I know that sometimes as adults, we feel funny about that because we're not necessarily, I mean, in your situation, you might be this person's, boss or higher up or admin, but
right.
oftentimes it's another speech therapist in the district or another speech therapist, like you said, at the company or whatever it is. But I think that we have to get over that, especially if we're tasked with being the supervisor, because it's what we've been asked to do as part of our job. And it's going, that feedback that you're giving everybody that you've ever supervised, that feedback is going to help them serve all the clients over the course of their
Yes,
career and build their competency. And that's what people don't understand, that it is a really big deal to provide supervision and mentorship. And you are taking it very seriously and you have a whole system and format. And I love that, because if people don't, I just feel like it can feel overwhelming as a supervisor if you're not sure. Maybe you work for a small company, maybe you're the only SLP there that's able to provide the supervision. And then you have to see all these clients and come up with some way to
right.
supervise. So it can be hard for the supervisor too.
Exactly. So the more you can standardize it, the more you can,
Mm-hmm.
create your forms and have your supervision binder, because, I'm
Yes.
old school. And
Yeah.
um,
Same.
but the last part of this is managing conflict. And that's another part that is never talked about.
Mm-hmm.
I want everybody to have a fantastic supervisor experience, and I want their CF to go so beautifully. And every mentor that they've ever had, I want that relationship to just be amazing. I know that isn't always the case because I lived it for half of my CF.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I didn't have the tools at the time to manage that conflict. I went away, I figured it out on my own, I did what I was supposed to. You know, that would be handled very differently now. There's an expectation, I come to the table prepared with what I know, and you come to the table prepared with helping me figure out what I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing how to manage conflict without it becoming personal
Mm.
and devastating the experience is so important.
It is hard to accept feedback. I was actually I just presented at the Michigan SLP conference, which was really neat. I actually got to meet two members of the ABA Speech Connection, Sarah and Susan, and it was a cool conference. I talked about joint attention. My favorite,
I love it.
Nakia Dow was just like, oh, look, Rose presented on joint
Yeah.
attention again. Here we go. Her favorite talk. It is my favorite talk. Thank you.
But
I
it's
do
so
love,
important.
yes.
It is the foundation of everything. So
Yes, I
you
just
have
say the
to.
same thing over and over again. But I did go to one really great talk, and it was actually a CFY, somebody in their CFY, and then the CFY supervisor. And I forget where it's in Detroit, and it's a very large healthcare system up there. It seemed like a very kind of exclusive place to get a job for medical SLP. This
Okay.
person had moved from out of state, but it was a very thoughtful presentation about these nuances of supervision, just about how she accepted the feedback and how they would have these meetings. And I was just so impressed by this person giving this talk at a training like this during their CFY year. I just felt so
That's big.
timid slash not ready for that. But I was like, wow, this person is really going to just move mountains if they're able to get up during their
That's
CFY
awesome.
year. Yeah, isn't that amazing? And
That is
so
amazing.
it was just a really
Good
nice
for
talk about
them.
some of these nuanced things with supervision, which I think are so important. So I guess, what if you have a supervisor? I think this is what gets tricky too. If you have a supervisor and you're just in this horrible situation where I know this happens for BCBAs too, because if you're a speech therapist listening, I actually own a company called Supervision Academy, where we provide supervision for future BCBAs. So when you're becoming a BCBA, you have to have this supervision. And I talk to a lot of people on those initial phone calls, and they have these horrific stories of maybe they got hired into a company and they were promised free supervision
Mhm.
and this, that, and the other. And it doesn't transpire. Or like a situation like yours, where you get into a situation where you realize that you're not going to have any support and you're dealing with these cases that are I mean, that case you told us about, I feel like I would be nervous about that. It's
Right?
just, yeah, because it's such a big deal. And it's like, I've never done that before. You know what I mean? Like something similar, but never that exact same thing. Um, I mean, what advice do you have for people if they're in, I guess, a situation that doesn't feel right?
The first thing to always do is address it with your supervisor,
Hmm.
as scary and awful as that may sound.
Hmm.
Because how many people, do we work with mentor, see in school who are like, "Ooh, I don't like conflict."
Right.
And it's, you know what? This doesn't have to be conflict, but it can be communication. So you go in and you go in prepared. I want to talk to you about our supervision. I have an expectation that these three things will happen. Is that how you see supervision? The two of you may be on wildly different pages. If the supervisor's receptive, then you can move forward. Okay, and ask that question: how do we move forward? How do we make sure that your expectations are met and my expectations are met, and the agencies that I'm applying to certification and licensures expectations are met?
Hmm.
Always go back to, what does ASHA say we have to do? What does the state of Ohio say we have to do?
Hmm.
If you try that and it crashes and burns, then it's time to reach out to the state of Ohio. There's a fantastic, you send a little email. I have a question. Greg Thornton might give
Yeah.
you a call and answer.
He was in my
I-
session at the Ohio SLP conference. He like came in the back and it was a 2 hour talk about middle school, high school. He listened to the whole thing and was so engaged. And at the end, I had worked in Beechwood for 10 years, which is a district up here. And
Mhm,
he was
mhm.
like, "Oh my gosh." He was like, "I loved your talk." And he goes, "I'm a Beechwood grad." So we like
Aw,
messaged on, I was talking to him after the conference too, but he is so helpful for
he
SLPs. I said,
is
like
so
here in the
helpful.
state, he does a lot of training. And I was just like, thank you for all that you do for speech therapists, because I've been listening to him talk about ethics and the laws and whatever
Right?
since I got my CFY here. And he really is, I'm sure every state is different, but he really has made a mark here in the speech therapy world, because we both know who
Yep.
he is.
We are very lucky to have him. And before, when you could call and leave a message, and now you have to use the email system. Um, but yeah, I would call and leave these, have questions about very odd scenarios, or now send an email, and he'd call. He's like, "Man, I always love reading your messages, or I always love getting your messages." But he is such a gift to our profession
Hmm.
in the state, because if it's not something that he can outright address,
Hmm.
he will put you in contact with who can.
That's great.
So new clinicians who are in their CF year, reach out to our state organization, reach out to ASHA
Hmm.
if those expectations aren't being met. Is there someone else in the company or someone in your graduate program that you can go back to and say, "Hey, am I reading this wrong? Am I overreacting? Or how do I advocate for myself? Because I don't want a mediocre CF. I don't want to just get by. I want to learn what I need to learn." So think of those mentors. They don't even have to be in the speech pathology discipline, but
Hmm.
think of those mentors that you've had in graduate school, in other jobs, other places in the company, and seek their counsel, because nobody wants to struggle through their CF.
Yeah, it's hard enough.
Right? Exactly.
It's hard enough as it is. So tell me, How can people get started? Like, what are your recommendations? I guess if somebody, number one, wants to be a CFY supervisor, and or some companies may have, and I know Asha at one time had a mentor program. Like, do you have
Right.
any words of encouragement for supervisors who might want to mentor somebody? I know, like in ABA speech, I provide mentorship and coaching for other speech therapists. Sometimes, there might be a speech therapist who has an SLP clinic and they're adding ABA and they have all these questions and, parent coaching. So from that standpoint, I have been doing that for a while, but somebody that's just getting started, what tips, strategies on how to start the process do you have?
So this is going to sound a little odd. I don't want you to think about the supervisee at all initially. I want you to do a great deal of self-reflection. If you say, you know what, I think I want to supervise a CF or a grad student, start out with some self-assessments. And there are some great resources. ASHA has a supervisor assessment. Linda Phillips Jones has a great one called the New Mentor and Protege. Excuse me. That allows you to really reflect on who you are, how you communicate, where your strengths are, and then where you might need to build up some skills before you take on a supervisee or a mentee. Then you can start looking at, what does this person need? Where are their strengths? Where can I support them the best? But my number one recommendation would be know yourself first.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's good for clinic owners to hear that too, because sometimes they are tasked with deciding who to ask to provide supervision. I know my friend owns a huge ABA practice here in my hometown, and supervisors for BCBAs, for new BCBAs, are people getting their hours. It was always kind of a challenge for her to find people who wanted to provide that BCBA supervision, because that's a whole other thing. And I feel like because that field is growing so rapidly, there's so many changes to the supervision. I know they've tacked on more hours that need supervised since I became a BCBA, and then it becomes more expensive, or you need to find a job that's going to provide that supervision. And you want to make sure, what I have found, clinics who are paying the supervisor to provide the supervision is going to be better because they're going to do a better job with the supervision. Supervision is not a passive experience.
No.
It's actually very dynamic. And yes, you might not be the one in the trenches doing the therapy unless you want to model something or you need help with a skill or something, but it really is a very engaging professional activity. It's just something that I don't think we talk about. It's nice that ASHA has that 1 hour. Is that what it is? A 1 hour?
It is
supervision
a 1 hour.
CE?
Yep.
Okay. And then for BCBA, it's a little bit more.
Yeah. State of Ohio is it 2 hours?
No, I haven't done that supervision in a while, to be honest. The CFY, I haven't done that. I know the last time I took a course, it was because I was doing CFY supervision.
Okay.
So, interesting. Okay. Well, yeah, we'll have to have you come back and maybe do a CEU. I think, having the resources, or just knowing, I talk about the ASHA website a lot because it is a really nice wealth of information. It's intimidating if you're never on there, but because we're an ASHA provider, I'm on there more than I want to be. So, but there is a lot of good information where they have practice portals and evidence-based practice areas where you can get other journal articles and downloads, and it's actually really helpful. But you have to have the time,
Exactly. You have to be able to data mine efficiently.
Yes, that's what we try to do here at ABA Speech. We're data mining for you. We're bringing you the information.
Which is wonderful.
Yes, that will make your life easier. Well, thank you so much for coming onto the show again. I really appreciate it. It's always great to connect.
Love it. Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to Autism Outreach. If you enjoyed the show today, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode full of actionable strategies you can use in your therapy room. Write a review too. That would mean so much to me. I always love hearing from you. Have a specific topic that you want included on a future show? Reach out over on Instagram, ABA Speech by Rose, or visit me at www.abaspeech.org.